A small farmer in Iowa was about to lose everything. His land, his house, his family's farm, even the old red barn his grandfather built by hand almost 70 years ago. And the reason sounded ridiculous. A giant seed corporation claimed he had stolen their patented crop seeds. They said he used their genetically modified seed line without paying for it. They said he planted it on purpose. They said he cheated the system. And they wanted him destroyed for it. The farmer's name was Daniel Miller. He was 52 years old, quiet, sunburned, and the kind of man who still shook hands like a promise meant something. For 30 years, Daniel had worked the same land outside a small town in Iowa. Corn in the summer, soybeans in rotation, cattle on the back pasture. Nothing fancy, nothing big, just enough to keep his family alive. But one morning, a black SUV pulled up to his farmhouse. 3 people stepped out. One was a lawyer, one was a company investigator, and one held a folder thick enough to ruin a man's life. They told Daniel his field had tested positive for Heritage Bioseed's patented strain. Daniel blinked. He had never bought seed from Heritage Bioseed in his life. He used old conventional seed from a local supplier. Cheaper, less productive, but clean. He saved where he could, because farming was already hard enough. But the company didn't care. 2 weeks later, Daniel received a lawsuit. Heritage Bioseed demanded $1.8 million in damages. They wanted a court order banning him from planting next season. They wanted control over his harvest, and if he couldn't pay, the bank would take the farm. When the story hit the local news, it didn't go the way Daniel expected. People online called him a thief. They said farmers always played innocent when they got caught. They said he wanted modern seed technology without paying for it. One comment said, "If you steal from a big company, don't cry when they come for you." Daniel's daughter, Emily, saw that comment at school. By lunch, everyone had seen the article. By the end of the day, Emily came home crying and said maybe she should drop out of community college to help save money. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his wife, Mary. The lawsuit papers were spread out in front of them like a death sentence. Mary asked him one question. "Did you do it?" Daniel looked at her, hurt. "No." She nodded. That was all she needed. The next morning, Daniel went looking for a lawyer. Every big firm he called turned him down. One lawyer told him straight up, "You don't have the money to fight this." Another said, "These seed companies don't sue unless they know they can win." A third one didn't even let him finish explaining. Finally, someone gave him a name. Ethan Cole, a young lawyer in a small-town office above a closed-down hardware store. Ethan had been practicing law for less than 2 years. His office had 1 desk, 2 chairs, a dying printer, and a coffee machine that only worked if you hit it on the left side. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich, and he had never taken on a company like Heritage Bioseed. But when Daniel walked into his office and told him what happened, Ethan listened. Not like a lawyer hunting for fees, like a man who understood. Because Ethan had grown up on a farm. His father had lost their land when Ethan was 16. A bad loan, a bad harvest, and one bad banker was all it took. So when Daniel finished talking, Ethan didn't ask how much money he had. He asked, "Do you still have the seed bags you used?" Daniel nodded. "Do you still have the purchase receipts?" "Yes." "Do you have maps of your fields, drainage routes, and neighboring farms?" Daniel paused. "I can get them." Ethan leaned back and said, "Then we start there." Daniel looked at him like he had just heard a door unlock. "Does that mean you'll take the case?" Ethan looked at the lawsuit again. Then he looked at Daniel. "Yes, but I need you to understand something. They're not trying to win a normal lawsuit. They're trying to scare every small farmer in the county." Daniel swallowed. "Can we beat them?" Ethan said. "I don't know yet. But if you're telling the truth, I'll find it." For the next week, Ethan drove across farms, grain elevators, seed warehouses, and muddy back roads. At first, everything looked bad. Heritage Bioseed's lab report said Daniel's field tested positive for their patented strain. Their drone images showed the crop pattern clearly. Their investigator claimed the plants were too uniform to be accidental contamination, and their lawyers had already built a perfect story. Daniel Miller was a struggling farmer. He needed better yields. He couldn't afford premium seed, so he stole it. Simple, clean, easy for a jury to understand. But Ethan noticed something strange. The positive samples came from the lowest part of Daniel's field, near the drainage ditch, not from the whole field, not from the center rows, only from one section near the water runoff. When Ethan checked the map, he saw that the field uphill from Daniel belonged to a much larger operation. That farm did use Heritage Bioseed products. And 2 months before the inspection, there had been heavy flooding. Water had run from the neighboring farm straight into Daniel's field. Daniel said it happened every few years. Topsoil, trash, sometimes even seed. Ethan asked, "Did Heritage test the neighboring farm too?" Daniel shook his head. "No, just mine." Then Ethan checked something else. The lab chain of custody form. It was supposed to show who collected the crop samples, who transported them, who stored them, and who tested them. But one signature was missing. There was a 6-hour gap between collection and lab intake. 6 hours where nobody could prove where the samples had been. When Ethan asked Heritage Bioseed for the original sample storage video, their lawyers said it was unavailable. The camera system had been down that day. Ethan smiled when he read that. Camera systems always seemed to be down when powerful people needed them to be. Court opened 3 weeks later. The courtroom was packed. Farmers came from 3 counties over. Reporters sat in the back. Heritage Bioseed sent 4 lawyers in dark suits, all carrying expensive leather folders. Their lead attorney was Richard Vance. He had a silver haircut, a smooth voice, and the kind of smile that made ordinary people feel small. Ethan walked in with one worn briefcase. Daniel sat beside him, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. Richard Vance stood first. "Your Honor, this is not a complicated case. Heritage Bioseed owns a patented seed line. Mr. Miller's field tested positive for that patented seed. He had no license, no purchase agreement, and no legal right to use it. Innovation costs money. Theft has consequences." He showed the lab report. He showed drone photos. He showed expert testimony. He even brought in a local seed dealer who claimed Daniel had once asked about high-yield seed but said it was too expensive. The message was obvious. Daniel wanted the seed. Daniel couldn't afford it, so Daniel stole it. Then Richard turned toward the jury. "If farmers can steal patented seed and simply claim it blew in with the wind, then agricultural innovation in this country is dead." The courtroom went silent. It was a strong opening. Too strong. Even Daniel looked shaken. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stood slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't act fancy. He just looked at the jury and said, "Mr. Vance is right about one thing. This case is simple, but not in the way he wants you to believe." He picked up a field map. "Heritage Bioseed wants you to believe Daniel Miller planted stolen seed across his farm, but their own test results show something different. The patented crop was only found in one low-lying section near the drainage ditch." He pointed to the map. "That ditch carries runoff from a neighboring farm, a farm that legally buys and plants Heritage Bioseed crops. 2 months before the inspection, that area flooded." Then Ethan turned toward Richard. "So before we call a farmer a thief, maybe we should ask a basic question. How did the seed get there?" "Axem." Richard stood. "Objection. Speculation." The judge nodded. "Sustained. Mr. Cole, stick to evidence." Ethan nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. Let's talk about evidence." He held up the chain of custody form. "Heritage's entire case rests on lab samples. But there is a 6-hour gap in the sample record. No signature, no video, no verified storage log." Richard gave a small laugh. "A clerical issue does not erase scientific testing." Ethan looked at him. "No, but it does make us ask who had access to the samples before they reached the lab." Richard's smile faded for half a second. Just half a second, but Ethan saw it. Then Richard called the lab supervisor. The supervisor testified that all samples were handled properly. He said the missing signature was a harmless oversight. He said the results were accurate. For a moment, Heritage seemed back in control. Then Ethan stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Palmer, you supervise sample intake at Midwest AgriLab, correct?" "Yes." "And Heritage Bioseed is one of your biggest clients?" "Yes." "How much of your annual revenue comes from Heritage?" "And..." Richard stood. "Objection. Relevance." Ethan answered before the judge could speak. "It goes to bias, Your Honor." The judge allowed it. The lab supervisor shifted in his chair. "About 38%. A few people in the courtroom whispered. Ethan continued. "On the day Daniel Miller's samples were tested, was the storage room camera really down?" "Yes." "For the entire day?" "Yes." Ethan walked back to his table and picked up a flash drive. "Interesting, because we subpoenaed footage from the building across the street, a grain equipment shop, Their camera points directly at Midwest AgriLab's back entrance. Richard went still. Ethan handed the flash drive to the clerk. The video appeared on the courtroom screen. It showed the lab's back entrance. At 11:42 a.m., a man entered carrying a white cooler. At 11:47 a.m., he left with the same cooler. At 1:15 p.m., he came back. This time, the cooler had a red inspection tag on it. Ethan paused the video. "Mr. Palmer, is that your lab technician, Jason Reed?" The supervisor swallowed. "Yes." "And why would Mr. Reed leave the facility with sealed evidence samples?" "I don't know." Ethan turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we call Jason Reed." Richard immediately stood. "Your Honor, this witness was not on the original list." Ethan placed a document on the table. He was added after the defense received new video evidence, and the court approved the supplemental witness list yesterday. Richard sat down slowly. Jason Reed walked in like a man who hadn't slept in days. He was 27, pale, nervous, and clearly terrified. Ethan approached him gently. "Mr. Reed, did you handle Daniel Miller's crop samples?" "Yes." "Were those samples altered?" Jason stared at the floor. Richard's jaw tightened. The judge leaned forward. "Answer the question." Jason's voice cracked. "Yes." The courtroom exploded. The judge slammed the gavel. "Order," Ethan asked. "Who told you to alter them?" Jason wiped his eyes. "My supervisor said the report needed to match Heritage's enforcement file. He said it was just business. He said the farmer was going to lose anyway." Daniel closed his eyes. Mary, sitting behind him, covered her mouth. Ethan continued. "What did you do?" "I mixed a small amount of Heritage-positive plant material into the test batch. Not enough to look obvious. Just enough to trigger a positive result." Richard stood. "This is outrageous. This witness is lying to avoid responsibility." Ethan turned toward him. "Then you'll be glad I have the internal lab messages." He submitted printed emails and text messages. The judge reviewed them. The room went silent again. This time, it wasn't silence from confusion. It was silence from shock. But Ethan wasn't done. Because once the lab evidence cracked, something bigger appeared behind it. After Jason's testimony, 3 farmers approached Ethan outside the courthouse. One said, "They did the same thing to me." Another said, "My farm was foreclosed 6 months after they sued." The third handed Ethan a folder and said, "You need to look at who bought the land." That night, Ethan stayed in his office until 3 a.m. He went through foreclosure records, crop insurance claims, bank filings, and land transfer documents. And there it was, a pattern. Small farmers got accused of using patented seed. Heritage Bioseed sued them. The lawsuit scared banks. Banks called loans early or refused seasonal credit. Farmers couldn't plant the next crop. They defaulted. Their land got sold. And the buyer was usually a company called Prairie Renewal Holdings. On paper, Prairie Renewal was just an investment company. But Ethan found corporate documents linking it to a former Heritage executive. Then he found another connection. The insurance adjuster who denied Daniel's crop loss claim had worked with the same bank that held Daniel's farm loan. That bank had financed several Prairie Renewal purchases. It wasn't just a seed lawsuit. It was a land grab. The next day in court, Richard Vance tried to recover. He argued that one lab technician's misconduct didn't prove Heritage had done anything wrong. He said the company was also a victim. He said Heritage acted in good faith. Ethan stood and said, "Then let's talk about good faith." He pulled up a chart. It showed 12 farmers in the same region, all sued by Heritage, all accused of seed theft, all with similar lab testing issues. 9 lost their farms. 7 properties were later purchased by Prairie Renewal Holdings. The courtroom got loud again. Richard objected. Ethan kept going. "Your Honor, this is no longer just about Daniel Miller. This is about a coordinated pattern of false accusations, financial pressure, and land acquisition." Richard said, "Counsel is making wild claims." Ethan looked at him. "No, Mr. Vance, I'm reading public land records." Then Ethan called a former claims manager from Heartland Mutual Insurance. Her name was Karen Doyle. She walked to the stand with a folder clutched against her chest. Ethan asked, "Miss Doyle, did your company handle crop insurance for several farmers sued by Heritage Bioseed?" "Yes." "Were you instructed to delay or deny claims involving those farmers?" Karen looked toward the back of the courtroom. A man in a gray suit stared at her. She took a breath. Yes. By whom? Senior management. For what reason? She hesitated. Then she said, we were told those farmers were high risk because of pending litigation. But privately, we were told not to help them survive the season. The courtroom went dead quiet. Ethan asked, what does that mean? Karen's voice shook. If a farmer can't get insurance money and can't get operating credit, he can't plant. If he can't plant, he can't pay the bank. Then the land goes up for sale. Daniel stared straight ahead. For the first time, he understood. They had never just wanted money from him. They wanted the farm. Richard Vance looked angry now. Not polished angry, real angry. Your Honor, this is turning into a circus. Ethan turned to the judge. No, Your Honor. This is what happens when powerful companies think small people can't afford the truth. The judge said, Mr. Cole, be careful. Ethan nodded. I am, Your Honor. Very careful. Then came the third turn, the one nobody expected. Ethan had been looking at the land sale cases when he noticed something odd. The same judge had approved emergency foreclosure motions in 4 of the related farm cases. Judge William Harlan. The same judge now sitting over Daniel's case. At first, Ethan didn't want to believe it. A judge could be wrong. A judge could be strict. But then he checked campaign finance records from Harlan's last election. Large donations had come through an agricultural policy group. That group had received funding from executives connected to Heritage Bioseed and Prairie Renewal Holdings. Then, Ethan found the final piece. Judge Harlan's brother-in-law owned shares in a consulting firm paid by Prairie Renewal. Ethan knew what this meant. He also knew how dangerous it was. The next morning, court opened with everyone expecting closing arguments. Instead, Ethan stood and said, Your Honor, before we continue, the defense moves for recusal. The room froze. Judge Harlan looked over his glasses. On what grounds, Mr. Cole? Ethan's voice was calm. Conflict of interest. Richard Vance slowly turned his head. Ethan continued. Your Honor, companies connected to the plaintiff and related land acquisition firms contributed significant money through an agricultural policy group supporting your last judicial campaign. In addition, your brother-in-law has a financial relationship with a consulting firm paid by Prairie Renewal Holdings, which purchased farmland from defendants in related heritage lawsuits. The judge's face hardened. Mr. Cole, accusations against the court are serious. I understand. Do you have evidence? Yes, Your Honor. Ethan placed the documents on the clerk's desk. Campaign filings, corporate records, consulting invoices, land transfer summaries. The judge didn't speak for several seconds. Richard stood. Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to delay a collapsing defense. But nobody believed the case was collapsing anymore. After a recess, Judge Harlan returned. His voice was tight. To avoid any appearance of impropriety, this court will transfer the matter to Judge Melissa Grant. He hit the gavel once. The old judge was gone. End quote. And for the first time, Daniel Miller felt like the courtroom floor wasn't tilted against him. When Judge Grant took over, everything changed. She allowed Ethan to expand his counterclaims. Fraud. End quote. Abusive process, evidence tampering, civil conspiracy, intentional interference with business. Richard Vance fought every motion. He lost most of them. Then Ethan called his final witness, a former Heritage Bioseed regional enforcement officer. His name was Paul Mercer. Paul had worked inside the company for 9 years. He looked tired when he sat down, not scared, just tired of carrying something rotten. Ethan asked, Mr. Mercer, did Heritage Bioseed have an internal program targeting small farms? Paul looked at Heritage's legal team, then at Daniel. Yes. What was the program called? Rural Compliance Expansion. What was its purpose? Officially, it was to protect patents. Unofficially, it was used to pressure small farmers near strategic land zones. Strategic for what? Consolidation, irrigation access, grain route control, future industrial agriculture projects. Ethan let that sit. Then he asked, was Daniel Miller selected randomly? No. Why was he selected? His farm sits between 2 large tracts already connected to Prairie Renewal Holdings. Without his land, the block is incomplete. Daniel's hands trembled under the table. Ethan asked, did Heritage know there was a contamination risk from the neighboring farm? Yes. Did they investigate it? No. Why not? Because accidental contamination didn't support enforcement. Ethan picked up one final document. Mr. Mercer, did anyone at Heritage instruct field teams to build cases first and ask questions later? Paul nodded. Yes. Who? Paul pointed across the courtroom. Richard Vance was copied on the enforcement memos. Every head turned. Richard's face went pale. For the first time, the polished corporate lawyer had nothing to say. Ethan looked at Judge Grant. Your Honor, at this time we move to dismiss Heritage Bioseed's claims with prejudice, enter judgment on liability for the counterclaims, and refer evidence of witness tampering, evidence manipulation, and conspiracy to the appropriate authorities. Judge Grant reviewed the documents for a long time. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Even the reporters stopped typing. Finally, she spoke. The court finds that the plaintiff's claims against Daniel Miller were built on compromised evidence, material omissions, and a pattern of conduct that raises serious questions beyond this civil case. She turned to Daniel. Mr. Miller, the claims against you are dismissed with prejudice. Daniel didn't react at first. He just sat there. Then Mary grabbed his hand. Emily started crying. The farmers in the back of the courtroom stood up one by one. Judge Grant continued. The court further grants the defendant's request to proceed on counterclaims for damages. The evidence presented today will be referred to state and federal authorities for investigation. Heritage Bioseed's legal team sat frozen. Richard Vance stared at the table. Ethan stood quietly beside Daniel. No cheering, no speeches, just the sound of a man finally being able to breathe again. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed toward Daniel. One asked, Mr. Miller, how do you feel? Daniel looked overwhelmed. I just want to go home, he said. Another reporter asked Ethan, do you believe this case is bigger than one farmer? Ethan looked toward the courthouse steps. Behind him stood dozens of farmers who had lost land, money, and years of their lives. Yes, Ethan said. I think this was never about one farmer. It was about how easy it is to crush someone when they don't have money, power, or a team of lawyers. A reporter asked, what happens next? Ethan answered, next we open every file. That night, Daniel went back to his farm. The lawsuit was not fully over. The damages phase still had to happen. Investigations would take months, maybe years, but the foreclosure stopped. The planting ban was gone. And for the first time in months, the lights in the Miller farmhouse stayed on without fear. Emily came home from school and hugged her father in the driveway. Mary stood on the porch, crying quietly. Daniel walked out to the edge of the field, where the drainage ditch ran low and muddy under the fading light. That strip of land had almost cost him everything. Not because he stole anything, but because someone powerful thought nobody would believe him. A week later, Ethan's small office changed. Farmers lined up outside the building before sunrise. Some carried folders. Some carried old court orders. Some carried nothing but stories they had been too ashamed to tell. One old man walked in, took off his hat, and said, they took my brother's farm the same way. A widow said, my husband died thinking everyone believed he was a thief. A young farmer said, I signed a settlement because they told me I had no chance. Ethan looked at the stack of files on his desk. It was taller than his coffee machine. Daniel stood beside him and said, looks like you're going to need a bigger office. Ethan smiled for the first time in days. Looks like it, but the story didn't end there. Because 3 days later, Heritage Bioseed released a public statement. They denied wrongdoing. They blamed rogue employees. They promised to cooperate with investigators. They said they respected American farmers. Ethan read the statement out loud and almost laughed. Then he opened his email. There was a message from an anonymous sender. No name, no subject, just one sentence. You found Iowa. Now look at Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. Attached to the email were more files, more farmers, more lawsuits, more land transfers. Ethan stared at the screen. Daniel asked, what is it? Ethan slowly turned the laptop around. Daniel read the first page, then the second. Then he looked up. His face changed. Not fear this time. Something stronger. Ethan said, this wasn't a county problem. Daniel nodded. No, he said. This was a system. Outside, the wind moved across the cornfields. For years, that wind had carried seed, dust, rain, and rumors. Now it was carrying something else. The truth. And for the first time, the truth had a lawyer.